Imagine this. You're going about your regular day. Things at the office are winding down. Only an hour and 15 minutes until you clock out. Suddenly, you hear your phone buzz. What could it be? You look and see it's your patient portal. It must be your lab results. You excitedly go to log in. You can't wait to experience the satisfaction of another year's normal lab work. That is until you see it. Your HbA1c. It's 9.1. That's odd. You have a suspicion of what this means, but you Google it just to be sure. Your search confirms the worst. This is solidly in the range for diabetes. You try not to panic. This can be managed, you tell yourself. You don't know all the facts now, but you'll start researching as soon as you get home. You try not to worry and focus on your work, but you find your mind wandering. Why not do just a little research now, you reason? The rest of your day passes quickly as you deluge the floodgates of information and advice you find on the internet. You tell yourself it's helpful, but something isn't sitting quite right with you. As you commute home for the day, your usually upbeat playlist sounds distant, and you find yourself overwhelmed. What you already know plus the advice you've seen opens up just as many questions as they do answers. Much of the advice you have seen seems contradictory. You don't know what's good information and what's misinformation of what you've seen. And the worst part, are you ready to give up all the foods that are actually good? Because let's just be real, you think. That's basically what all this is trying to say. Underneath the weight of all this, you start to feel at a loss for a plan. If only there were someone you could trust to provide a straightforward, evidence-based crash course to help give you clarity and empower you to start making a plan. Well, that, friends, actually happens to be the goal of this video today, which is going to be a crash course on eating with diabetes. See, the reason I've decided to create this channel is because as a registered dietitian, I see firsthand how misinformation regarding nutrition negatively affects people's physical and mental well-being. And my goal is to create fun, easy, accessible content to help others enhance their well-being by learning about nutrition. So let's jump into it. First off, I'll give you a basic overview of what diabetes is. Diabetes is a condition where sugar, otherwise known as glucose, in your blood tends to be too high. This all starts with the pancreas. The pancreas is an organ that makes insulin, which is a hormone that helps you use the energy in the foods you're eating. The problem with diabetes is that the body doesn't make enough insulin for the amount of carbohydrates you are eating. This can happen for two reasons. Number one, the pancreas doesn't make enough insulin because the body's immune system is attacking it by mistake. Whenever the body does this, it's called an autoimmune disease. And this is what happens in type 1 diabetes. And then number two, it can happen because the pancreas is simply exhausted. Over time, the modern American diet, high in processed foods and sugar, can just create too much wear and tear, making it churn out so much insulin that it can no longer produce the insulin it once did. This is type 2 diabetes. In either type, the result can be that the sugars your body isn't breaking down for energy are ending up in your bloodstream. And these sugars can cause unpleasant symptoms like feeling extra thirsty, feeling tired and lethargic, increased urination, and unintended weight loss. But that's not even the worst of it. Left untreated for long enough, those sugars, left to their own devices, can do a lot of damage to the body, damaging blood vessels, nerves, and even whole organs like the kidneys and the heart. But diabetes isn't just destructive, it's also incredibly pervasive. In the United States, 11.6% of the population has diabetes, most of which is type 2 diabetes. This means that 1 in 10 people have diabetes, and over 5,000 people are getting hit with a new diagnosis of diabetes every day, which is something I personally encounter all the time in my own line of work. And that is why I've chosen this topic to talk about in today's video. So without further ado, here are the most important things that I, as a registered dietitian, think you need to know about eating with diabetes. The first thing I'll emphasize before anything else is this. There are no good or bad foods. Even though it's a pretty common platitude to hear people say moderation is key, the idea that there are good, angelic, healthy foods and then there are bad foods that we all love still persists very much. Many people I talk to who have a new diagnosis of diabetes, in fact, are expecting me to give them a list of foods they can and cannot eat. That is definitely not the goal. So absolve yourself of the idea that foods somehow have moral implications. By and large, it is possible to enjoy a variety of foods in moderation, and it's really more of a question of how much and when. In fact, in diabetes, it really is the amount you consume that is most important. Let me use an example to show what I mean. We'll compare 2 meals. In the first meal, we have 1 whole wheat bagel and 1 cup of cooked old-fashioned oatmeal. In the second meal, we have 1 Eggo waffle and 1 tablespoon of maple syrup. Which meal do you think will raise your blood sugars more? The answer may surprise you. You probably think the waffle is worse because it has more sugar and is less nutritious. But it's actually the first meal that would raise your blood sugars more than the second meal. And the reason for this boils down to the amount. The bagel and the oatmeal would give you 86 grams of carbohydrates, while only 1 Eggo and 1 tablespoon of syrup would have 27 grams of carbohydrates. And from the perspective of the pancreas, even though the waffle may digest slightly faster, it simply takes much less insulin to break down 27 grams than it does to break down 86 grams. This is also the reason why it is recommended to avoid skipping meals and even opting for smaller meals and snacks throughout the day. Let's say you eat 165 grams of carbohydrates in one day. If you skip meals and eat 2 big meals a day, this means you're eating about 72 at each of these meals. But if you eat 3 meals and 1 or 2 smaller snacks, you aren't eating more than 45 grams at one time. And while this adds up to the same amount for the whole day, the second scenario is much easier for your pancreas. So you can see that having a grasp on how much you're eating at one time is what will matter the most. Which is great because it shows you that there is room for flexibility rather than simply writing off foods as bad or forbidden. But that isn't to say that the type of carbohydrate isn't important at all. In fact, it can be beneficial to moderate specific types of carbohydrates. One reason for this is that it is true that some foods digest or get turned into sugar a little bit faster, just like I touched on in our waffle example. And we do have a fancy term that attempts to capture this concept, namely glycemic index and glycemic load. This is something that I hope to unpack in more detail in a future video, but I don't want to get too deep into this today. And the reason for that is, in my opinion, this concept of glycemic index and glycemic load can sometimes feel a little unnecessarily complicated. Instead, I think you can get most of the same practical benefits by understanding the difference between simple carbohydrates and complex carbohydrates. So what do we mean by simple and complex? Well, this refers to how simple or complex it is for your body to break down and digest these carbohydrates. So simple carbohydrates, as you may imagine, include foods high in sugar, things like cakes, sodas, and fruit juices. And it also includes something we call refined grains. Refined grains include things like white rice and anything made from white flour. The alternative to a refined grain is a whole grain, such as brown rice and things made from whole wheat flour. Essentially, the difference between these two is that refined grains are more processed. Let's think about a grain of wheat. In its natural form, when we harvest a grain of wheat, there are a few components of this. That is the bran, the germ, and the endosperm. The endosperm is mostly starch, while the bran and germ contain more fiber and vitamins. If we take this grain as it is and grind it into flour, then we have whole wheat flour, which we can then use to make whole wheat pasta, whole wheat bread, and so on and so forth. These products tend to have a little bit of a denser and firmer texture because of the fiber that comes from the bran and the germ. However, let's say we don't appreciate the taste and texture of those whole grains, so we remove the germ and the bran, leaving only the endosperm. Well, when we grind that up, we get white flour, which is lighter and has a milder taste, but breaks down quicker and easier and has less nutritional benefit. For that reason, it is best to try to consume more whole grains and less refined grains. Complex carbohydrates can also encompass high-fiber starchy vegetables like beans, lentils, peas, and sweet potatoes. So in general, it may be helpful for your blood sugars to consume more complex carbohydrates because your body digests and absorbs them a little bit slower. But as we highlighted in our previous example, the type of carbohydrate doesn't matter as nearly as much as the amount. So why take this into consideration at all? Well, I actually think there are simpler, more practical reasons for doing this. One is that a complex carbohydrate tends to be more beneficial with nutrients like fiber and vitamins and minerals. And the other reason is that it is simply easier to moderate complex carbohydrates because they're more filling. Think about it. Which do you think would be probably easier to do? To eat only a half a cup of oatmeal or eat only one pancake? Probably the former, right? That's because the oatmeal has more fiber to help you stay full, whereas the pancake breaks down quickly, making it harder to feel full from a smaller amount. To build off of this, another helpful tip is to include protein at every meal, because this also helps keep you full and satiated, as well as being nutritionally important because it preserves lean body mass and performs important functions in the body. In particular, lean proteins, that is, proteins lower in saturated fats, like poultry, fish, and lean plant-based protein, will help balance your diet and help with moderating carbohydrates and keeping your blood sugars stable. So now that we've talked about the basics, let's get into the more fine details. So far, I've talked a lot about moderating the amount, but none of that is really useful unless we actually define what that is. And that's where it's useful to understand what a serving of carbohydrates is. One serving of carbohydrates has 15 grams, and how many servings you should aim for depends on a variety of factors. This chart provides some general guidelines on how many carbohydrates are appropriate based on gender and weight goals. This is a bit of an oversimplification since there are many factors that can affect what a good goal is for you, but it is a good starting point, and it's very useful for helping people understand what's in the ballpark of reasonable. It can be useful to have a basic idea of how many carbohydrates are in different foods. For example, knowing that one slice of bread or one small piece of fruit is one serving or 15 grams, while a regular bagel or a large cookie is 4 servings or about 60 grams. This can help you understand which foods you may need to be more careful about moderating. And of course, the best way to find this information is by knowing how to read a nutrition label. Let's take a look at this one now. Say we're looking at a nutrition label for this pack of tortillas. To know how many servings of carbohydrates are in this, we want to look at total carbohydrates. If we know that one serving of total carbohydrates is 15 grams, and we see in this example this tortilla has 13 grams, we know that this is close to one serving of carbohydrates. Under total carbohydrates, we also have some other helpful information. We see here where this label breaks down how many of those 13 grams of carbohydrates are coming from fiber, from sugars, and from added sugars. So in this example, 2 grams are coming from fiber. This is also where we can calculate something called net carbohydrates. Net carbohydrates are simply the total carbohydrates minus the amount of fiber. The reason we do this is because the fiber is special. While it is considered a carbohydrate, your body doesn't digest it. That means that the fiber won't affect your blood sugar at all. This can be useful to know, especially because there are some foods that are purposely made to have a lot of fiber so that it won't affect your blood sugars as much. In this particular case, the net carbohydrates would be 11 grams. But let's look at a product where the net carbohydrates make a much bigger difference. For example, in this carb-balanced tortilla, we see that there are 19 grams of carbohydrates, but 17 of those are from fiber. So in reality, there are only 2 grams of net carbohydrates, which is much less than even one serving. The other thing to look at is, of course, the sugar content. Now, the way this appears on the label can be confusing to many people because the label lists sugars, or total sugars, as separate from added sugars. So the total sugars are the amount of carbohydrates in the serving that are from all sugars. This means that it includes natural sugars, like the natural sugar we find in fruit or milk, while the added sugars are just whatever sugars come from things like white table sugar, honey, syrups, and so on. So to break that down, let's look at this fruit cup with Jell-O. In one cup, there's 24 grams of total carbohydrates. Of these, 22 of those carbohydrates are from sugars, and 20 of those 22 sugars are from added sugars. This means that there are 2 grams of sugar in each cup that are from fruit, while most of the sugars are actually from the added sugars contained in the Jell-O. In general, When we look at these numbers for added sugar and for fiber, a good rule of thumb is that 5% or below of the total daily value is considered low, while 20% or higher is considered high. So now that we've gone through all of that, I hope that this information gives you a good starting point of navigating nutrition with diabetes. Just as a disclaimer, this is meant to be for general education purposes only. What works for you as an individual will depend upon your specific situation and your medical history. That's where working with your own registered dietitian and/or diabetes educator can be very useful to help you come up with your own plan. But I hope that this has made the topic a little less daunting and given you somewhere to start. And before I close, I want to emphasize one last thing to remember through all of this. And that is to remember that it's okay to take all of this one step at a time. Making changes to your lifestyle and diet can definitely feel like a daunting prospect. But rather than feeling overwhelmed and daunted by your long-term goal, you can make more progress by setting one realistic goal at a time. So that's my challenge for you today. Take one thing from this video and ask yourself what's one realistic step you can take today for better health. So that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned for more informative nutrition content coming soon.